Welcome back. You're listening to Make Planning Make Sense. My name is Aaron Zimmerman, and I'm a director at Centro Planning Consultancy.
And I'm Alex Roth, a planner at Centro Planning Consultancy, and we'll be your hosts.
In today's episode, we are going to speak with Tom Slater, the managing director of T2S Architecture.
I think architects tend to be seen as almost the main character of development team.
I think it's more like a buddy cop movie. I'd say it's probably co-equal the number of times that a planner or an architect would be the first to be appointed.
It's one of these roles that everyone thinks of when we think of development. And in fact, a lot of the time, when I tell people what I do, I'm a town planner, they ask me, oh, is that like architecture? So
we're really excited to share the conversation with you, especially a few things that really stood out to us.
What stood out to you?
What did stand out to me?
What did stand out to you? So Aaron, what are your top takeaways from our conversation with Tom?
Well, I really liked the way that we talked about incentive structures for individual stakeholders and actors in the planning process.
I agree, Aaron. Do stay tuned for that. What was interesting for me is, as we touched on in episode 1, the role of planning agents has emerged to support the design team, which famously includes the architect. And we work with architects in an iterative way to produce the best possible design response to a given context. In that sense, I think our conversation will shed a lot of light onto how we work together with architects to navigate the planning system.
Absolutely. And as always, our email is podcast@centroplan.co.uk. Ready to jump in?
Let's go.
Here is our conversation with Tom Slater. Tom Slater, thank you for being here.
Hi, Alex. Hi, Aaron. Thank you for having me.
So if we could start off perhaps with just sharing with us how you came to your current job.
Well, beyond the standard, I wanted to be an architect since my parents bought me Lego, which isn't actually true anyway, but that is the common architectural inspiration. But weirdly,
SimCity, yeah,
or SimCity. But I have wanted to be an architect for a very long time, since I was about 10 years old, I think it was, or 12 years old. And how I became an architect was obviously taking a ridiculously long 8-year course in Liverpool, and then moved down to London around 10, 11 years ago, where I joined a practice called 21st Architecture Limited, worked there over 9 years, became a director, and then in the end decided to part ways in a very amicable fashion to create my current company, which is T2S Architecture Limited. Mm-hmm. And in that guise is obviously where, as you guys will know, I've worked with you with Centro over multiple projects, and largely extremely successfully, may I add, on behalf of our clients. So T2S, we're a company 4 years old, set up in the heart of COVID with a 4-month pregnant wife. So it was quite a brave move, but
no pressure.
No pressure there. I do remember seeing my wife's faces drop at the thought of me setting up my company. Just thought, well, there's financial security out the window. But we are where we are, and I think I'd like to say I've made a success of it. If I may just speak briefly on architecture, I think you have to have that passion, and I think the minute that I've lost that passion, I probably won't even bother, because
you have to like the subject matter, right?
I mean, yeah, I was always told as a kid from my dad, if you can do something that you enjoy, you've never worked again, and actually, he's right. I know it's kind of a bit. I know what you're thinking. It's all a bit. Oh God, I know, and I rolled myself as I said it, but it's true.
Fair enough. I mean, I think that we're going to unpick some of those details in the course of this interview. But fair to say, we have worked quite a bit on projects across Greater London with great success. If you have a planning question, we'd love to hear from you. And I was curious if you could just sort of talk through a typical day.
Typical day, trying to be as structured as possible, because you often get those people on LinkedIn that say you need to have your default diary. So I do try and stick to my default diary and check my emails in the morning, in the afternoon, but that invariably goes out the window by about
5 a.m. every day, and I go for a swim.
11:30 in the morning. By the point I've checked my emails for the 10th time, and really I should be focusing on my task in hand.
Yeah.
Almost every day there's something in the planning world that we're just having to respond to as diligently as possible to make sure that we keep that momentum and keep the speed of the application at the forefront of the planner's mind. When I was a Part 1 20 years ago, all those years ago in Liverpool, and I submitted my first planning application for an office building that was sizable, £3 million, £4 million job. And it was all done by hand. You put that forward and then you submit the planning application. You hear nothing for 4 months, and then invariably you probably got consent. And I just think, okay, you fast forward 20 years where, we've just done a planning application for a hotel conversion, and there were 15 consultants involved. There were no other reports required for that office building. None of it. It was just plan sections, elevations. There wasn't even a 3D view. What you would need for that now would be 10, 15 different reports.
Yeah.
And I guess I would simply, not even trying to be pithy, is to ask why. Why do we need 15 reports to justify that planning application? What is the reason for it? I honestly don't understand.
When
I'm not putting that on you guys, by the way. You guys are merely reacting to the process.
Yeah, exactly. And part of our role is not to just be an inbox and then to say, oh, an officer wants XYZ. We also want to make sure that that information is relevant to determining the application. We put that question back to the officer. And sometimes it's like, there's a climate emergency. Have you heard? It's like, yes. But like, what determinative element of this application will this information actually speak to? Why are we asking for this exact same information every time? It's not actually testing for a variable. But there's more than just sort of the process gripes that go into that additional information. I think part of it is that planning has certainly become more complex because certain things have been sort of brought forward in the process that would normally be handled, or in the past have been handled at a later stage.
Yeah, and I think that I understand that. So, for example, if you use Grenfell Tower as an example, the Building Safety Act now introduces what's called the golden thread. And as part of that golden thread, you have Gateway 1, 2, 3, and 4. And Gateway 1 is a way of saying for a building that if it's high risk, as in it's 7 stories or over 18 meters tall, or has one residential unit within it, it's classed as a high risk building, and therefore you have to submit a fire report at Gateway 1, which is at planning stage. So that's a very obvious example of what you're talking about. And of course, that's very prescient to say, are we designing a building and getting planning for a building that is going to keep people safe? So I have obvious sympathy for that process. I think where my sympathy starts to wane is when lots of these other reports are loaded onto the top, and I'm not quite sure that the risk profile of the topics that those reports are responding to are the same. Why do you need to submit an ecology report early? Why don't you do that as part of building regulations? And so I understand that there's a series of variables to it and vagaries, but I just think that there's a culture to it that needs to change. Something that I just touched upon with Alex just at the start of the podcast was a statistic I saw for a new train line that's being built between Portishead and Bristol. It's 3.3 miles long. The planning application needed 80,000 pages of documents. And someone took the time to work out that if they put those documents next to one another, it would be actually longer than the train line itself. So I just wonder whether, do we think that it's good for the economy that architects and ecologists and planning consultants and all of this can charge work and it's loaded on the client and it boosts the economy because you're doing all of this work? Is that part of the reason why we're doing this?
I think another aspect of what you're saying is that are the evidence requirements that are being asked for worth it in terms of their benefit and their cost, right? And if we think about something like fire, obviously that's a very important thing to get right. But then you mentioned other aspects that perhaps don't have the same level of risk or perhaps the same level of benefit. And we don't necessarily think about things in terms of their cost either. So I think what I'm hearing you say is we produce a lot of these pieces of evidence at pretty astounding cost, not just in terms of monetary cost, but also in terms of cost of not getting the development and housing and economic growth.
Well, it just increases the idea that it's a bottleneck, and so that's the visual, isn't it? This idea that how many schemes are held in the planning process that could actually be used to deliver the housing that we need. Something that you touched upon earlier about delivery of housing. Is something that I looked at before I came over to you guys. And in the first quarter of 2025, if you compare the first quarter to 2024, London is the only region in the UK that registered fewer dwellings. And I think that's potentially more of a building safety act than maybe a planning point. But
net new properties.
Yeah, net new properties. Okay. And there's a London-centric issue to this, which is obviously even more prescient. So I think that sort of housing crisis and the impact that, whether it's the Building Safety Act or planning, the way it's impacting and preventing the delivery of those homes, I think we're feeling it more in London than perhaps anywhere else.
I think that can only make sense. And we have had clients come to us and say, we might acquire this site, it's got a permission, but it needs a second core. And there isn't even really a consistency there. So between LPAs in London, some will say, you know what, we get it, it's a pickle, just put in a Section 96A because we know why you're doing it. We're not going to come at you suspiciously about every detail again. Others have had to use Section 73s in different authorities. So again, there's another element of uncertainty. And I think that there's a lot of regulation and guidance that sets general parameters and then says, okay, kids, go figure it out, which would be fine if that sort of alignment happened shortly thereafter. But on so many of these issues, the alignment never even occurs until maybe there's a court judgment that finally sets down a debate. Mm-hmm. And so not only is it a curveball unto itself to have the Building Safety Act, but it is muddying the waters with uncertainty for the foreseeable future. And that is also just one example. I think a lot of the trade press takes changes to statute or regulations and then says, oh, okay, how is this going to affect this and this? Well, it could do this, well, it could do that. Then it's bad policy making, right? Policy making should reduce uncertainty, not add yet another layer of uncertainty, in my view. And the state has that monopoly on the right to develop, but the state should also know what it wants, not, well, I don't know, I'll kind of know it when I see it, and you should come at me with a new application.
Is there something cultural there on that ambivalence that you're talking about because of that confusion in policy? Is there something a little bit English in that? And I'm asking two North Americans here, of course.
I am English now, actually. Thank you.
I'm actually Austrian. Fun fact.
Of course.
Yeah, fun fact. I lived in America a bit too long.
But you've got something to compare it to. Okay, well, that's interesting. England's different to this place and this place is different. Plus or minuses, I'm not right or wrong.
It is something that I've definitely thought about before. I think there is something very English culturally about the English planning system in the sense that we practice planning in a way that is to an extent rooted in cultural values. And there are certain values that we don't like to write down too explicitly. And there's this sort of implied etiquette around our approach to development.
And you can take that all the way up to way up to British governments in a way that there is still not written governmental policy because we don't really like writing things down. Because it's all just a bit cricket. It's all just a bit...
I mean, we don't do certain things in planning because, for example, it would be unneighborly,
Yes.
And whereas I think if you went to Germany, you would not see anything like that.
Someone told me once that the key difference they knew between the US and UK planning rules was that in the UK, planning is seen as almost an art form. And in the US, it's more of a science where this building is this and it's worked out and it's zoned and it's rigorous. And in the UK, there's an artistry to, well, we need to take every site and its own individual merit as opposed to seen in a wider whole. Discuss.
Well, Aaron, you've mentioned before, we have a kind of zoning in our planning system as well. We have hints at, this is a town center, quote unquote, zone. We zone very...
We don't have zoning, but we have contribution areas, town centers.
But those zones are to say you can't do anything here.
Local industrial areas. Well, it's that you can't do anything else.
True.
Or that you can't do this thing in other places only here, right? But either way, that's a type of zoning.
It is a form of zoning. I'll take that point.
I want to go back, though, to this idea that all of our jobs are just to throw papers around and write, as previously stated in emails, back and forth. Because I think that can happen. But I think the most constructive way to really make planning make sense, trademark, is to
Great name, by the way. Great name.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think the fair thing, and it is probably true, is to assume that everybody in the planning system is acting in good faith as far as that individual actor defines it. And so if I'm acting in good faith, if the officer is acting in good faith, the consultee is acting in good faith, the architect is acting in good faith, and still things aren't getting done, then we have to look at how those problems are arising from the way that the regulatory regime is structured.
But this isn't the point. It depends on what you're going to class as get things done. Because if we're as consultants, the planning process, we can charge fees, and therefore in theory we're being productive. But actually, what are we delivering?
Have you stolen my show notes from like later in the season? We're gonna do a little bit of reflection on that, because it is like the housing crisis. It's this sort of cloud over the entire conversation. We say make planning make sense because we know it so well. We can say with authority, we want planning to work better. But that is again related to housing delivery, the cost of living as a millennial. Like, I think that there is definitely a bigger question to ask, which is, for whom is planning working right now?
Not young people.
Not young people, not landowners.
I mean, every basic statistic on home ownership and the age range and average house price compared to average wage. If I was 21, I probably wouldn't want to read those statistics, because they don't make for good reading. Where in, the 1970s, the average house price was 4 times the average wage. It's now about 9.5, 9.6. And that very basic thing has a huge impact on everything. It means, and I manifest this, it means 2 people have to work as opposed to 1 person has to work, for example. It means that people choose to live at home longer with their parents as opposed to moving house. It also therefore impacts how many children people are having, because they have to have the financial burden of the mortgage because of the house price rise. And I don't think Western society has really dealt with this or knows how to deal with this, because it's not just a UK context. This is happening in Japan, South Korea. The average house price just has shot through the roof. Wages haven't followed, and it's having a really strange impact on how many babies we're having.
The UK is particularly bad, I have to note, right? So just to avoid that sort of, well, everyone's a bit shit, so fine, we're a bit shit.
No, that wasn't me excusing us. It wasn't me excusing us.
I know. This was for our dear listeners, just to clarify. But I think that the Centre for Cities had a really good study on this, which was a comparative study between the UK, Germany, France, and we can put the link to that in our show notes. If the housing supply had kept pace with population in the UK, at least at the same rate that it had in Germany and France since the end of World War II, there would be, you can look at the report yourself and correct me on the exact figure, but I think 4.5 million more homes that would exist today in the UK.
There's no excuse for why we haven't built those homes, because you actually look at the raw data on the UK, and 65% of England is agricultural use, and about 10% of England is built environment. The rest is just stuff.
And 0.00005% is forest. But
sure.
I know that's just sorry, I'm from North America, so.
But my point is, people lose their mind about the green belt. I mean, these green belts are huge. The green belt's about 25% of England. The size of the green belt in England is 2.5 times the size if you were to merge every single city in England together.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm on the Great Western Railway service back into London, when we're approaching Reading, I'm getting my stuff together to get off at Paddington. It's not that far, right? Let's be serious about that. We'll be right back. We should have a Greenbelt episode anyway, but there's all sorts of conversations about how the Greenbelt is really just sort of an idyllic make-believe for people who can afford it, because the development just leapfrogs it, right? And Reading is exploding, and that's a picture-perfect example. People are moving to Hitchin because that's the closest place they can find a house. But I wanted to kind of bring it back a little bit, because we're talking about a lot, and I love it. But architecture and planning, is there sort of a way that you feel a tension between planning expectations and the client brief? Now, we've worked on projects together, so I know that you've gotten emails from us or you've been on DTMs with us where we're like, oh no,
Tom, you can't do that.
That's really not the correct proportion of 3 beds. Or like, is that balcony really 1.5 meters deep? There is a tension that I know you feel for sure.
Sorry, Tom.
No, that's just all part. That's just all part
Friends
of it.
tell each other the truth.
Yeah. That's all just part of the process. We don't design buildings on our own, and that should never, ever be the case. But yeah, I don't think tension's the right word to use, because I think that the purpose of that building is to get planning, ultimately, because that's where the value is, and we would.
There's no point to try to design something that has no chance at planning.
Of course. Yeah. Why would you create that tension, and why would you be sort of resistant to that? So that the feedback, to call it a nice word, is that, and it's a case of making sure that we deliver for our clients. And I know that's a bit of another perhaps eye roll answer, but it's true.
We use the word results.
Results.
Hashtag results.
And it's also not going to involve the architecture, because within the design process, there's what does this building have to comply with? What does it have to do in order to get to the end result?
Yeah.
And then there's the little bit of time that we can go, okay, I'll scribble away with my SketchUp model, and I'll sort of work away numerous different designs and refine where that's at to try and create something that hopefully does, looks great. And then there's this sort of process of going back to you guys to go, okay, I managed to actually do this, or make the balcony a little bit bigger by push-pulling and everything else. So I think the short answer is that's all just part of the process, and I wouldn't try and get resistant to that, because in the end, it's not my scheme, it's the client's building, and we're there to deliver to the client. But I think that that's just you doing your job, and you having to have that uncomfortable conversation with Tom to go, Tom, your balcony doesn't work. And I'll go, okay, it doesn't work. I think it's all just part of the process, gents.
Yeah. To what extent do planning policies actually inform your design process in the early stages?
It's fundamental. And as part of my advice to a client, if they come to me with a site, I will have to do a very quick high-level assessment of, okay, this site. This one in particular was in Putney. It was in a conservation area. It was near a listed building. So my advice to the client, even at that very early stage, was, okay, these are the very high-level planning constraints, because they are going to inform the design. And this is, again, the weird thing with planning in this country, because you talk about those planning constraints, and then what was the shard? I mean, who initially had the idea for the shard and went, do you know what this site needs around all of these really low-lying 4 to 5 story old Georgian terraces? I think we could build a 60-story tower here.
I mean, all these planning constraints, but ours is so case by case, it's so discretionary. No, you can probably look at a site and with 15, 20 minutes of checking up on a couple of things, you can say they are not going to be impressed with anything that is outside of these parameters.
But then the shard.
Right. Or the London Eye. And the actual answer is, where there's a will, there's a way. So you could be in a conservation area where everything, or frankly, in most cases, almost everything, is 2-story plus pitched roof terraces. Maybe there's like a 3-story building at this corner. Maybe there's a 5-story building that was built in the 70s down the street, but that can't be used as a precedent. And you propose a 3-story building. Hell hath no fury.
How dare you?
Yeah. And at the same time, you can be across the river from a UNESCO World Heritage Site and build a giant cable-stayed Ferris wheel, which also, by the way, required knocking down parts of the listed river wall. So in a system like that, you can get to yes if everybody just agrees. You can kind of do anything that everyone agrees is okay. But the flip side of that is that creates an incentive structure where an applicant has to feel the need to push the envelope, and the decision maker has to feel the need to be on the complete opposite side of that negotiation.
Not just that, but because it's vague, the applicant feels there's a chance that they can push the envelope and get more by just pushing, because it's unwritten. And everyone can point to the shard and go, well, how did they do the shard? So every developer's thinking, well, maybe we can do another shard.
Yeah.
And if you're going to have to go through a very lengthy planning process, an expensive planning process, just to get what is basically status quo for that site anyway, then you're probably thinking to yourself as an applicant, I might as well go big, you know?
Absolutely.
If I'm going to just, you know, apply for what's basically, you know, an infill of this site, and it would just be kind of the height and massing that we would expect here anyway, and the use that we would expect here anyway, and I still have to produce X number of pieces of evidence, and it's going to cost me this much, then I might as well just go all the way.
Sure.
Yeah.
When you just mentioned the UNESCO World Heritage Site, it reminded me I was involved in a scheme once that was opposite Tower Bridge. Mm-hmm. The site was contaminated.
How can it be opposite Tower Bridge?
It was the Royal Mint.
Right.
And the land was contaminated because it used to be a plague pit. And so during the
How
plague,
much plague money do I have in my gym bag right now?
There must have been just a big hole where they threw all the dead bodies that had the plague, and over time that had contaminated the land. Sorry, that just little anecdote just popped into my mind when you mentioned UNESCO World Heritage Sites.
Yeah, normally contamination isn't really thought of in terms of human remains.
We were never involved in the end, which was a shame. It would have been definitely a career high.
That's sick.
But it was all true.
Yeah, I want to come back to this point that you mentioned about increasing evidence requirements over your career as an architect. Was there a turning point where you began to really see this happen, or something, and a specific example that sticks in your mind of?
Yeah, I think that when I moved to London, I noticed that the scrutiny was a lot higher for planning applications here than it was in Liverpool and Manchester. You couldn't build the same building in London and Glasgow. Right. Because in London, the London plan will say, well, you've got to reduce Part L carbon reduction by at least 35%. That doesn't exist in Glasgow. What planning policy in London does is it says we're going to insist on a condition to do with acoustics, right? So we're in Islington, I think, right? There's most residential applications in Islington have a condition that says this building has to improve upon the dB rating by, I think it's 7 or 8 decibels based upon the regulation. Does that mean that people in Islington have slightly more sensitive hearing than people in Sunderland?
They actually might. If you read some neighbour consultation responses from
are people more deaf in Manchester than they are in London? I find that interesting, and I think it's to do with house prices.
There is still a non-London divide, or the 2005 today divide, however you want to slice it. And some things have really lifted the tide.
But equally, they're saying, okay, well, we need to supplement building regs, because that's effectively what that is saying. When Islington puts a condition, it's saying, we don't think the regs are good enough, so we're going to put something on to supplement that. In my opinion, you don't need to supplement that. If the regs are wrong, the regs are wrong. But perhaps the sad realization of that is because of maybe the wealth inequality between London and everywhere else, is the regulations have to have some sort of weird midpoint to say, well, we accept low regs for everywhere else, but then we're going to allow London to do its own regs because everyone's a little bit more wealthy. That feels like what that is saying.
Perhaps also because you have land values where they are. They probably think to an extent we can get ourselves a bigger slice of the pie in London, can't we, when it comes to sustainability or whatnot?
What's the pie if you're saying these windows have to be better in Islington than they are in Middlesbrough or my hometown, Burton-on-Trent?
Just in the sense that it would be perhaps more expensive to put in an increased noise attenuation.
I don't understand who benefits from that.
I think that the mindset is that in terms of extraction, right, it's extracting the highest quality and the best sort of used experience of that development as a concept of public good, really. And now is our chance to protect that future resident and the future resident after that from that noise. But I think that there is kind of a problem with all of this, because we're talking about these things in how they delay developments through the planning process. And the land values are high in London because supply is so much lower than demand. That's not a privilege. It's not a privilege to be able to wring every drop out of developer because the land values are so high because of a crisis in which planning plays a key part.
Home ownership is a huge part of the British economy and a huge part of British wealth. And so it wouldn't surprise me at all if governmental policy became planning policy in a sense of saying, well, we need to try and retain the value of this commodity that is so intrinsically linked to the wealth.
Yeah.
of the country. But there are articles that suggest that actually building loads of houses wouldn't massively impact the value of homes anyway.
I would caveat the simple supply versus demand point that I'm making here in terms of housing delivery with the fact that, of course, there's all sorts of other things that are going to be a factor, right? Homes are just more expensive to build than they used to be, but they're also much more airtight and better insulated, and they don't burn fossil fuels, right? And there are other things like the cross-subsidy model for affordable housing, which incentivizes development to go luxury, however defined, right? So there's also the way that the bespoke and discretionary nature of the planning system inhibits economies of scale. Everybody complains about sameness, but Victorian terraces all looked the same. They were still nice.
And they're still nice and they're still desirable now.
And it's not like each of those windows was custom order. You know what I mean?
No, there was sliding sash and in the wind they move. Because I've lived in a Georgian terrace. And they're beautiful windows. And
not celebrating the quality of the windows, but rather the fact that you didn't have to get them custom sized. And
they're lovely to slide. They're very satisfying to watch the little cogs move and the rope moves as you move your sliding sash, but they move in the wind. Beautiful windows, but providing natural purge ventilation. Because they are not sealed
natural purge
properly.
ventilation.
But
no, I don't even know what your point is. You unpack that, sorry.
Natural purge. When I'm shivering in the winter before the heat comes on in the morning, I'll think of that, Tom. Natural purge. I also live in a Victorian terrace house.
At least the air movement is of high enough quality so you don't live, not living in a space with stale air.
Yes. And it still somehow doesn't prevent the black mold from accumulating on the windowsill.
Yeah, because that's not true.
You can't have everything, can you?
History. Just to recognize, right, planning is one bottleneck. And of course, we're talking about these things from the perspective of practitioners. So we are talking about sort of the process issues of planning. But again, it's just worth pointing out there that there are so many other problems. Land banking. Is it real? Is it not? If it is real, then it's a problem.
It's disappointing, they noticed. It's disappointing in a way to see that a Labour government has come in and made planning reform and housing delivery really much front and centre on their portfolio. And after a year in charge, all of a sudden say, well, the way we're going to deal with this is by stymieing or enforcing more tax on developers who aren't, in their opinion, building fast enough. Yeah. It feels that when I saw Keir Starmer announce that, it disappointed me a lot because it feels like they're running out of answers on this one.
I think that they're not being brave the way that they needed to, the way that they talked about doing it. Because, as more information comes out and the bill is debated, just off of the top of my head, I think it was the limiting planning committee sizes. Sounds good. The number that they're looking at the moment is limiting them to 11 councillors. Okay, right? But that's not that unusual in London. You might have only 7 or 8 people show up. I've been to ones with fewer for sure. The same with the national scheme of delegation. It would be like a requirement to delegate S96As, householder applications, some other stuff, I think certificates of lawfulness. To what extent is that actually moving the needle? The changes to the NPPF were, I'll say it this way, they're going to be as effective as all of the other language in the NPPF has been so far.
Do we think what's missing is perhaps these insights from planning and architecture and building practice that are perhaps not feeding in as much as they should into, not to, plug our podcast here in a subtle way. I do think that this is part of the problem, that these insights from day-to-day practice are not feeding in to legislation and policy making in the way that they perhaps could.
Yeah.
And there are things happening with the absolute best intentions. I know some people listening might think, well, energy efficiency, noise attenuation, we've gotten buildings that are much more energy efficient. We have affordable housing delivery. We have urban greening and all of these benefits, being implemented with the best intentions. But
I certainly think there's a bit of a disconnect there between at the minute with the government and the implications of their policy on business and the private sector. And then you get to the point, should local government build more homes? And then Angela Rayner came out very strongly and said, we're not going to build the homes ourselves. We want more affordable homes, but we don't think the government should pay for it. And I'm aware of a model that one of my prospective clients is looking at where you get private finance to fund the delivery of affordable homes. And these models have existed for some time, and I've experienced...
Super excited for that, by the way.
Of course, it sounds amazing, but of course, the resistance that they've had to that model, where you would think, you know, Mr. Hi, I would like to build affordable housing for a borough in London, and it won't cost you a penny. And you would expect the response to be, oh, thank you, yay. And in fact, it's like, no, go away, you horrible, horrible, horrible person. We're going to make
this isn't how we do things, though. This isn't how we do things, though.
And the experience, that process has kind of blew my mind, because you think the timing of this, or of models of a similar scale where you get a bank to finance it and it's over 40 years because it's a lease, it's affordable homes. You can control the value of it over 40 years. You can get all the money back from over provision of energy.
Can I go back to something, though, that really kind of speaks at the core of why my job has to exist? You had mentioned that people say in North America, planning is like just rules, and in the UK, planning is like an art. But the example that you just mentioned about the rigidity in not being curious about new and better ways to deliver what we, at this table at least, agree planning needs to get better at, kind of flies in the face of saying that it's an art. I would say perhaps planning here is a bureaucracy.
Yeah, you're right.
It's a computer that no.
I think that thinking is where people are so disconnected from the results of their actions. Institutional thinking, I guess, would be the posh way of putting it.
Planning is designed to be an art in the UK. I think it's something that I would be happier to agree.
It's been designed to be an art, but somewhere along the line it's become overly bureaucratic.
Yeah. All right. This has been so much fun. We're not quite done yet. I might even just cut out this little segue.
I mean, it sounded great. If I listen back to this and that bit's cut out, I'll be really hurt.
Everything sounds great in these headphones, though. That's the trouble.
I have one question that would be maybe a nice one to end it on.
Absolutely.
For both of you. My question is going to be, if you had one piece of advice for Angela Rayner, let's say.
The Right Honourable Secretary Rayner.
The Right Honourable Secretary Angela Rayner, about planning and architecture practice to feed into upcoming legislation and national policy decisions, what would that be?
Well, is any of this helping young people? The answer's no. So I would perhaps just like to remind her to say, look, give young people a break, because none of this is helping the younger generation here. And if we're not careful, we're really just going to push people away from this country and get a significant brain drain. From an architectural perspective, in terms of my advice, whilst we've talked about the number of reports and whilst it's frustrating, the reality is that what it does mean is that when you design in the building and you have input from lots of different people like yourselves, you make the design better. And that's absolutely fine. And that's actually fantastic. But where we've lost is the delivery of that quality of the architecture and the input. Are we using all of that policy to actually deprive or prevent the delivery of homes? And then I would make a reference to my earlier point that ultimately their job is to help young people because they're the future of this country. And it doesn't look as if young people are getting a lot of help at the minute.
I counted two things there, but I really liked the second point. You know, there's the forest for the trees thing.
Could you privatize the planning process properly?
I really don't think you need to be honest. And as frustrating as it is sometimes that the LPA has no actual incentive to get applications through within the statutory period, there is something positive to be said for the fact that they don't have at least a financial incentive to do so. Other than SIL, but apparently that's not big enough of a carrot. That's fine.
We need to turn our attention to
housing.
Yeah.
I'd say housing and making my life easier. And making the officers' lives easier. And actually probably, more likely, achieving better outcomes doing so.
I have a piece of advice which I'll say. I would say, and I hope this is being done already. I'm not going to assume this isn't being done already, but my advice would be go and speak to an applicant team. Go and speak to a team of planning agents and architects that have worked on a planning submission.
Madam Secretary, you're welcome to our offices anytime.
That's an invitation. And see... And speak to, obviously, the local authority as well and see how that process was and see where the bottlenecks were and how those requirements actually manifested in practice.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point and a really good place to end. So again, Secretary Rayner, if you ever need people on a commission for the next white paper, let us know.
You are right and honourable and very much welcome.
Yes, Madam Secretary, please write to podcast@centralplan.co.uk. Tom Slater of T2S Architecture, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, both. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Tom.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please follow us on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you'd like to get in touch, then we'd love to hear from you. Please write to us at podcast@centralplan.co.uk. Make Planning Make Sense is presented by Centro Planning Consultancy and recorded in beautiful London, England. Its executive producer is me, Aaron Zimmerman. Additional production by my colleague and co-host Alex Roth. Marketing and promotion by our colleague Reese Raymond. Graphic design by our colleague Mariam Malaxi. Music by Joseph McDade. From all of us here at Centro, thank you so much for listening.